Hello, my name's David Bruce. The first time I started to feel like I'd gained some real knowledge of how to orchestrate was when I sat down with a score of a Beethoven symphony and just really tried to figure out exactly why each note was placed in each instrument. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the kind of things I found here, but I hope this might be useful to you even if you're not interested in writing for orchestra. I'm going to talk about musical concepts or effects that can be used even in, say, electronic music contexts. And in particular, stay tuned for a surprising comparison between Beethoven and these guys.
Do you have the time to listen to me whine?
So we're going to look at Beethoven's Third Symphony, and let's start by looking at the opening chord. We're going to have a simple E-flat major full orchestra loud staccato chord. And we've got 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 3 French horns and 2 trumpets. The horns and the trumpets are the old valveless ones, so as Beethoven wrote for them, they could only play the overtone series of E-flat with some optional extra stop notes in between. We've also got a timpani and a full collection of strings. Now, a general principle when you're orchestrating a chord is it's good to have each group, the winds, the brass and the strings, making a harmonically full chord by itself, or at least to sound pretty good in isolation. So you'd be unlikely, for example, to have just the third and the fifth of the chord in the brass. So let's first listen to the chord and see what stands out. Strongest are the trumpets, both sounding an E-flat in octaves. There's also a strong E-flat whack on the timpani and in the basses and cellos. 2 of the French horns also blast out E-flats, also in octaves, but the third plays a G. This is a small example of the brass part making harmonic sense by itself. If there had been just the octaves and an open fifth instead of a third, that would have gone against the usual rules of classical harmony. You can sometimes omit the fifth, but never really the third. So let's listen again. To me, the most prominent thing we can hear next is the scrunch of the strings. Here Beethoven's quite clever. He manages to squeeze in a lot of notes into the violins. The firsts play a quadruple stop, playing all 4 strings, sounding out a full E-flat major chord, with G's at the top and the bottom. And the seconds do a similar triple stop, but with E-flat at the top. So the upper notes of the 2 violins all fill out an E-flat major chord. So to play all of those notes as a staccato, the violins have to move the bow quickly across all the strings. It makes for a vigorous, almost violent ripping sound, which really helps generate the energy in these opening chords. Below that, the violas fill out a 2-note chord on E-flat and G. So overall you can see that the string chord is quite G heavy. We have 5 E-flats, 4 Gs and only 1 B-flat on the top there. So this matches that missing fifth in the brass. If we listen again, try to make out the winds. In many of these kind of tutti chords, it's quite hard to make out the winds at all. I think the flutes probably come through adding a sense of light at the top of the chord, and perhaps the higher clarinets can add a more strident tone. The oboe and the bassoon will just marginally enrich the colour of the tutti, but if nothing else, it looks good to have everyone blasting out these 2 opening chords. So overall, it's still interesting to note how few fifths there are in this opening chord. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why this would be. I think perhaps Beethoven wanted a slightly more open sound. A full and clear triad with all 3 notes equally sounding might have sounded a bit too final for an opening. This one sounds confident, but it leads outwards. It doesn't sound too resolved yet. If we compare it to the chord that ends the entire symphony, well, it's pretty similar. The main difference is that there are fewer Gs. All of the brass play just E-flats, and the violins just leave an E-flat at the top rather than the full chord. So it's slightly more E-flat heavy at the end, but still a surprising lack of fifths. This kind of spacing of the notes may have just been Beethoven's preference. Here's the one at the start of the 7th Symphony, which is remarkably similar. It's in A major and it's all A's and C sharps, the tonics and thirds, very few fifths again. And here at the end of Beethoven's 5th, again mostly tonics and thirds. The only fifths here are in the strings. So it does appear that in these full orchestral chords, this kind of sound with mostly just tonics and thirds was just a preference that Beethoven had. So next I want to skip ahead from the opening a few bars and imagine we're adding in this phrase and we want a light pure-toned woodwind sound. The phrase fits on our horns, and we can double it an octave higher in the clarinets. It would also add a nice fresh sound to add another octave higher above that in the flutes. That works well in the first few notes, but although the B flat at the top of the flute is playable, at least today, it probably wouldn't have been in Beethoven's time, but even today, when you get to such extremes of an instrument, the extremity becomes more of the thing you hear more than the pitch itself. You would hear this breathy, extremely high note, and it would stick out compared to the grace of the other notes. So in that case, you might be tempted just to leave off the flute altogether. But Beethoven instead relies on a trick of the ear, something you might call ear leading. He starts the phrase with all three instruments, but then he simply omits the last notes of the phrase on the flute. But our ears don't really notice. We follow the melody as it continues on the other instruments. The ear is led to them just like the way some painters lead your eye along a line to a point of focus. There's an even better example of the same concept a few bars later. Here in the brass, the trumpets and horns play the main theme of the movement, followed by a repetition of the last phrase a third lower. But listen again, and listen carefully, and you'll notice that the third repetition a third lower isn't actually played on the brass. It's just left playing on the lower strings. At this point, the brass just play held repeated notes. There's something very clever about this. The brass stop playing the melody because they just don't have the notes there. But if you are orchestrating this, you might be tempted to omit them here and then perhaps try to emphasize the melody elsewhere, perhaps in the upper strings and winds. But Beethoven makes little effort to continue the strength of the melody. He trusts that our ears will listen out for it and follow it. He's not even afraid that the brass will drown it out. He lets them continue blasting out on repeated notes. But in doing so, he further tricks our ear into thinking that the entire phrase is written in the same way. We don't particularly notice any drop in dynamics because there isn't any. All of the instruments are still playing. But it's quite striking when you realise that under all this surface noise, the tune is only continuing down in the lower strings. It's a wonderful sleight of hand. A related kind of sleight of hand can be seen here in the way Beethoven achieves a downward scale. The overall effect he was after was clearly just a downward scale from F down to the B flat an octave and a half below. Notice how some of the instruments skip upwards once their register becomes too low, like the flute suddenly jumping up an octave here. Within the context of the overall downward scale, you won't particularly notice this sudden jump. It'll just feel like someone turned up the EQ a bit to bring out the higher frequencies. Now perhaps you're not confident that this is what he's doing here. After all, this jump happens in the same place in the flutes, clarinets, bassoons and second violins. Perhaps it's more of a motivic idea. Well, check out the same phrase in the recapitulation. In this case, the flutes and the clarinets jump up the octave at different points in the scale. The whole scale is now a fifth lower, and here they are making that jump at the point which makes most sense for the instrument. So we jump up to that high flute sound rather than letting it get lost in the mix. And you could potentially go on forever with a continually downward sounding scale. All you have to do is keep sneaking the instruments back in at the higher register, and you end up with this sort of Escher-like continuous downward spiral. And finally, I want to skip ahead to the third movement of the symphony, which is probably one of my favourite Beethoven movements. To me, what this movement is all about, and this is a pretty common trick for Beethoven, you can hear it a lot in the opening movement as well, is holding us in a state of suspense. And the main trick I think Beethoven uses to achieve this is he shows us something that clearly has a lot of power, but power that is held back. So it feels exciting to us to know that there's something powerful around the corner. So we have the entire string section in the opening chopping away at these fast staccato piano chords in the heavy lower ranges of the instrument to give us this impression of tense, subdued power. It's like someone powerful muttering away and you just know they're going to explode at any moment. And yes, this is where we get to that Green Day comparison, because this is a trick you can also hear in blues, rock and heavy metal in the form of a good old palm-muted guitar. Suppressed energy in the verse. bustling out into full energy in the chorus. Suppressed in the verse.
Do you have the time to listen to me whine?
Full energy in the chorus. It's the same trick. In the Beethoven, when the explosion does happen, it's quite unexpectedly in the fourth repetition of the melody line. It seems like we're just going to hear the same phrase again, but this time out of the blue it comes at us full tilt. And it vanishes back into piano again just as suddenly. Perhaps my favourite little bit of orchestration is at the end of the movement, where the effect is transferred to the timpani. Again, another potentially very powerful instrument, but just tiptoeing away marked pianissimo, before the whole orchestra explodes one last time into the final fortissimo chords. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends. And consider joining my patrons over at patreon.com. And I'll see you next time. Whatever.